We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Now I can say, antiwar.com has a piece entitled The Unreality of U.S. Foreign Policy. This weekend, the Post reported that the Biden administration has drawn up plans for a sustained military campaign targeting the Houthis, or Ansar Allah, in Yemen. For those who may understandably have lost count, that would make 3 regional wars the Biden administration has embroiled us in over the past 3 years. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest books are entitled I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne Reader, and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, Dr. Horne, operations in Yemen, it's reported now, will take a lot longer than anticipated. And there's another story in the Wall Street Journal. U.S. intelligence officials estimate Israel is nowhere close to its goal of eliminating Hamas after 3 months of relentless airstrikes and ground operations in Gaza. The longer this drags on, the more it looks like Vietnam. And we know one thing. These conflicts are easy to start, but they are really, really hard to end, Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, certainly you have a point. And in fact, what may be happening with regard to Ansar Allah, or the Houthis as they're referred to in this country, is that they may be demonstrating a new means by which so-called poor countries can confront so-called richer countries. That is to say, it's the equivalent of the Yemenis going to Best Buy or some other electronic store and getting cheap drones and then outfitting them in order to prevent or at least hamper the transit of vessels through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, disrupting commerce between Europe and Asia, not only between Europe and Asia, but also implicating North America as well. That in turn is helping to add inflationary pressure to these already stressed economies, particularly Germany, which is becoming the sick man of Europe because of its going along with escapade in Ukraine. And Washington basically has no answer. In fact, you may have seen the brief interview at the White House when Mr. Biden was leaving to take a helicopter. And he basically conceded that the bombing of Yemen was not accomplishing its goals. But he also said that it would continue, which I think probably helped to inspire that writer at antiwar.com. But as if that were not enough to contemplate, keep in mind as well that flying under the radar is this war game, this military exercise, this NATO exercise. Speaking of steadfast defender, since the Cold War, there has not been a military exercise this gargantuan. It will last for 4 months. It involves 90,000 troops, 31 nations, plus Sweden, which is supposedly going to display its military mettle, which will then ease the path for it to officially become part of NATO. And of course, the tip of the spear is the United States of America. It's designed to go or to simulate what would happen if NATO has to frontally, as opposed to indirectly, as we see in Ukraine. But what happens when NATO frontally has to confront Russia? That is to say that this steadfast defender military exercise in some ways is a kind of stage rehearsal, I'm afraid to say, for World War III. And in case there are those in your audience who think I might be engaged in inflationary rhetoric, keep in mind that Admiral Rob Bauer of NATO has basically told the member states to prepare for war, up to and including instituting conscription, a military draft. Other commentators are suggesting that in response, Russia will not rest recumbent as this is taking place on its border. And speaking of its borders, I'm sure you must have seen that attack on a facility just outside St. Petersburg just the other day, presumably by the Ukrainians, but wiser heads may not rule out the participation of one of the Baltic states, particularly Estonia, or not to rule out Lithuania or Latvia. In any case, this may cause Russia to step up its consultations with its allies, particularly Iran and China, not to mention the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Speaking of the latter, if you look on the front page of the New York Times today, you'll find a sort of harem-scarum article about how the DPRK is preparing for war, we are told, against the U.S. allies, speaking of the Republic of Korea or South Korea. So in many ways, what's happening, with all due respect to antiwar.com, soars far beyond what we are now understandably focused on with regard to the Yemenis and the Red Sea and the alleged and purported threat to Israel, because speaking of the latter, we know that the end game for Israel is to somehow encourage and entice a more than willing U.S. imperialism to jump headlong into this fray on the premise that U.S. imperialism somehow will be able to overthrow the regime in Tehran. As Israel sees it, the regime in Tehran is basically at the point of the axis of what they would consider to be the axis of evil, although, of course, from Iran's point of view, it's the axis of resistance, because as they see it, it's Iran that's behind the Yemenis, it's Iran that's behind the Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, it's Iran that is behind the Iraqi regime, which is now encouraging U.S. troops to evacuate their territory. And I dare say that if this kind of confrontation continues, the world will be aflame and it will not escape the borders of the United States of America.
Dr. Horne, if you could compare all of that to the internal threat of the empire. You know, here we have the Democrats are looking to run Joe Biden, who can't find his way off of a stage on a good day. He's running away with it, no question about that. The little question what's going on there, and the system here is, they're on red alert over Trump. Hundreds of thousands of people in the street in Germany. People are furious at their governments in Germany and France. So you have governments saying, we've got to go after this country or that country. Meanwhile, internally, these countries are economically, politically, and culturally extremely unstable, more so than they've been in a long time. And dare I say, as a result of their foreign policies when it comes to the various actions that are being taken against Russia, China, et cetera, with the various types of economic actions that they're taking. Dr. Horne.
Well, the sobering news that's just come over the wire from CNBC, the business channel, is that their survey of business executives suggests that particular element, that particular 1% of the socioeconomic pyramid, are more than willing to make their peace with the GOP frontrunner, speaking of Mr. Trump. And you might have seen the interview with Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase from the Davos World Economic Forum, where the elite come to meet and greet, where he basically gave a thumbs up to Mr. Trump. He said that Mr. Trump was somewhat right. I think that was his formulation with regard to immigration, with regard to China, with regard to NATO. Interestingly enough, he was strangely echoed by the otherwise or alleged left-wing filmmaker Michael Moore, who provided a sort of rationalization for why Trump has a 75 million strong base. And this is sobering news because whatever Mr. Trump plans with regard to Ukraine, the fact of the matter is that it does not necessarily bode well for Iran. It does not bode well for the People's Republic of China. And I think that step by step, where the world is heading, that is to say, the non-U.S. world is heading, is to where the world was heading about 2 centuries ago, when the decision was made that somehow there had to be a coalition to corral Napoleon's friend, which was like a bull in a china shop. And today's bull in the china shop happens to be U.S. imperialism, not only with regard to presenting a threat to international peace and security, a threat to regimes from Moscow to Tehran to Beijing to Pyongyang, but also stirring up conflict between Morocco and Algeria, stirring up conflict between Venezuela and Guyana, stirring up conflict between Iran and Pakistan. You might have seen how those two predominantly Muslim nations exchanged missiles at each other just the other day, stirring up conflict between Afghanistan and Iran, stirring up conflict between Israel and Syria. And of course, the latest in that unfortunate litany is that as we speak, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is on an Africa tour. Now, the good news is that perhaps he will not be able to help to accelerate these brush fires, particularly with regard to Yemen. The bad news is that it appears that a purpose of his jaunt to Angola is to try to convert that Southern African nation into a kind of juggernaut targeting its neighbors, because U.S. imperialism is very upset with the fact that not only has South Africa brought this case in the International Court of Justice against Israel for genocide in Gaza, but just the other day, South Africa had the temerity, the audacity, from Washington's point of view, to join U.S. and U.K. as aiders and abettors, dragging them into the dock. This is raising fury in Washington. It helps to shed light on this journey to Angola, but I don't think that it's going to work out. I think the Angolans will recall how the U.S. imperialism tried to collaborate with South African apartheid to prevent their independence over 40-odd years ago.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back. Folks,